You are crying. Someone comes. It is not always your mother. For most of human history, this was not unusual. This was the plan. Today, a crying baby often means one exhausted parent, alone in a room, running on no sleep and no backup. For roughly 95% of human history, that scenario would have looked almost unrecognizable. A baby's cry pulled in aunts, grandmothers, older cousins, sometimes half the camp. Nobody raised a child by themselves. Nobody was expected to. So how did ancient humans actually raise their children? Not the sanitized version. The real one, pieced together from skeletons, from surviving forager societies, and from decades of anthropological fieldwork. Let's start with a number that reframes everything. A modern woman spends more time in labor and more energy on each individual pregnancy than almost any other primate. Human babies are born early, underdeveloped, and helpless, compared to other apes. A chimpanzee infant can cling to its mother's fur within hours. A human infant cannot even hold up its own head. Anthropologists call this secondary altriciality, a fancy way of saying human babies are born too soon, because our skulls are already almost too big to pass through the birth canal. The trade-off is a child who needs years, not months, of total dependence. That dependence should have been a death sentence for the species. A mother tied down with a helpless infant cannot also gather enough food to feed herself, let alone older children. So how did it work? The anthropologist Sarah Blaffer Hrdy spent years studying this exact puzzle. Her answer, laid out across decades of research, is that humans are cooperative breeders. Unlike most mammals, human mothers did not raise children alone. They raised them inside a web of what Hrdy calls alloparents, literally, other parents. Fathers, yes, but also grandmothers, aunts, older siblings, even unrelated adults in the camp. Childcare was distributed. It had to be. A lone mother with a helpless infant, no backup, and a hungry belly does not survive the Pleistocene. Picture it. A woman is nursing an infant under a rough shelter. 20 feet away, her mother is cracking nuts with a stone. Her sister is watching 3 other children play near the fire, none of them her own. An older man, not the child's father, is fixing a spear shaft while a toddler tugs at his knee. Nobody looks out of place. This is not a special occasion. This is Tuesday. The anthropologist Barry Hewlett documented something remarkably close to this scene among the Aka people of Central Africa, foragers whose way of life still preserves fragments of this ancient pattern. Hewlett found that Aka fathers held or stayed within arm's reach of their infants for roughly half of the daylight hours, a level of paternal closeness almost unheard of in industrialized societies. Fathers were not occasional helpers. They were primary caregivers, as routinely as mothers. Why does this matter? Because it tells us something the fossil record alone cannot. It tells us that the modern image of parenting, one mother, one father, one house, one crying baby with nobody else coming, is not the ancient default. It is closer to the exception. There is a second piece of evidence, and it comes from an unlikely source: grandmothers. Human females are one of the only species on Earth that live decades past their ability to reproduce. Why would evolution keep an individual alive long after she can no longer pass on her own genes directly? The anthropologist Kristen Hawkes studied this among the Hadza, hunter-gatherers in Tanzania, and proposed what is now called the grandmother hypothesis. Older women, freed from pregnancy and nursing, spend their days gathering food for their grandchildren. Hawkes found that this extra labor let mothers have their next child sooner, without starving the older one. A grandmother's foraging, in other words, may have helped shape the entire human lifespan. Menopause itself may exist because grandmothers were once too valuable to lose. So what did a single day actually look like for an ancient child? Let's reconstruct it. You wake up already surrounded. Not in a crib in a separate room, but pressed against a warm body, maybe your mother's, maybe someone else's. There is no silence. There is smoke, low conversation, the sound of a stone tool being worked. By the time you can walk, you are almost never alone. If your mother goes to gather roots or nuts, you might go on her back, tied in a sling made of hide. Or you might stay behind with a grandmother, an aunt, an older sibling only 7 or 8 years old, already trusted to watch a toddler near the fire. The anthropologist Melvin Konner spent years among the Kalahari's Jew/Hoansi sand, and what he documented about infancy there appended a lot of assumptions. Jew/Hoansi infants were held or carried almost constantly in the first year of life, nursed on demand rather than on a schedule, and rarely left to cry alone for any length of time. There was no strict bedtime, no separate nursery, no training a baby to self-soothe in an empty room. A cry was answered, usually within seconds, by whoever was closest. Does this mean ancient childhood was some kind of idyllic paradise? Not entirely. Life was also dangerous. Skeletal evidence from Paleolithic sites shows infant and child mortality that would be considered a catastrophe today. In many forager populations, a large share of children did not survive to adulthood. Constant closeness was not indulgence. It was risk management in a world with predators, disease, and no hospitals. Holding a baby all day was not softness. It was survival strategy. Here is the counterintuitive twist. You might assume that a childhood spent constantly held, constantly surrounded, would produce dependent, clingy adults. The opposite pattern shows up again and again in the anthropological record. Forager children, raised inside this dense web of caregivers, were often given remarkable independence by modern standards. By 6 or 7, many were already contributing, gathering food, minding younger children, learning to track animals, absorbing survival knowledge not through lectures but by simply watching and copying adults. The anthropologist Polly Wiesner, who studied the Jew/Hoansi for decades, documented something else revealing. Much of children's learning happened after dark, around the fire, listening to adults tell stories. Not instructional stories about survival skills, those were told during the day, matter-of-factly. The nighttime stories were about relationships, conflicts, spirits, gossip. Children absorbed the social rules of their world by simply being present for adult conversation, night after night, year after year. That is worth sitting with for a moment. Ancient children were not shielded from the adult world and then formally taught how to enter it later. They were inside it from birth, absorbing everything, all the time. Now hold that against a modern household. A single set of parents, often living far from grandparents, siblings, or extended kin. A child cared for the most part, by 1 or 2 exhausted adults, or by paid strangers, in a structure that would have looked almost unrecognizable to a Jew/Hoansi grandmother or an aka father. It is not that modern parents are doing something wrong. It is that they are trying to run an ancient cooperative system with a fraction of the ancient crew. This is not a call to abandon modern life and move into a hut. But it explains something a lot of exhausted parents feel and rarely have words for. The isolation, the sense that raising a child alone in an apartment feels unnaturally hard. It is not a personal failing. It is a mismatch. Human children were never designed to be raised by 1 or 2 people in a closed room. They were designed for a village that, for most families today, no longer exists. So the next time you see a parent struggling alone with a screaming child on a plane, or hear someone say it takes a village, remember that this is not a folksy expression. It is closer to a biological fact, forged over hundreds of thousands of years, encoded into how human infants attach, how human children learn, and how human societies once organized themselves around the simple, urgent problem of keeping the next generation alive. You are crying. For most of human history, someone always came. The question worth asking is not why their instinct still lives in you. It's why, for so many people today, no one else is close enough to hear it.